Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones and here to answer your questions tonight, Australian philosopher and ethicist Peter Singer, Environment Minister Greg Hunt, American performance artist Adrienne Truscott, Howard Government Minister turned broadcaster Amanda Vanstone and the Shadow Minister for the Environment and Climate Change Mark Butler. Please welcome our panel. Thank you very much. And our Facebook audience suggested we talk about blaming the victim and direct action for climate change, and we will. Let's go to our first question tonight. It's from Greer Brennan.
Floyd Mayweather stood to earn over $180 million from the fight on Saturday, which was watched with much excitement from fans around the world. He also has a long history of violence against women, including an attack against his child's mother. How can we as a society claim to take issues of domestic violence seriously, whilst at the same time condoning the actions of this man through watching and cheering for him?
Adrienne, let's start with you.
I think it's an incredibly huge problem. I think when it seems rampant throughout a lot of sports, especially sports that are male-dominated and seem to require really aggressive male physicality. I think it's no wonder it may spill out past their job into other parts of their lives. But we're certainly seeing that in the States recently a little bit with the case of Ray Rice as well, who was caught punching his wife. And in that instance, he was suspended indefinitely from the NFL, from our football league. I do not know how a man who has that many counts of being convicted for that kind of violence, particularly somebody who has spent his entire life learning how to use his hands to be destructive.
7 counts of domestic violence, including punching women in the head.
Yes.
7 counts against 5 women.
Yes.
It's pretty shocking, isn't it? I mean,
it's incredibly
were you surprised at how many of the world's most powerful and richest people turned up and, in fact, had a huge traffic jam of private aeroplanes in Las Vegas airport?
Yeah.
Just to see him?
Yes,
well,
I think
not just to see him, but to see the fight.
Yes, I think it's really shocking, and I think it speaks to the fact that there is a certain level of our society that is sort of accepting of violence against women. That it's like a way of life. In some cases, it's one of the things that just exists in our society, and we just have to sort of get used to it, or accept that it happens. The world's a difficult place, and I think that if you don't address why it happens and the source of why it happens, you're not going to get rid of it.
Peter Singer, the fight of the century. What does it tell us about ourselves? One of the combatants is someone with the serial counts of domestic violence.
Well, I think Adrienne's right. It tells us that we're not really taking this seriously enough. And if it was someone who had attacked people because of their race, there's no doubt that he would be out of the sport. The sport couldn't put on somebody who made a habit of punching people because he objected to whatever race they were. And the same would be true of football and any other sport. So, why is it that you can punch women and the sport doesn't out you? I guess it's because these sports are male sports, and you're playing against, you're boxing or playing football against people of varying races, but you're not doing it against women. And so they don't get a say in the sport, perhaps.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, it's a huge problem in our country, and I know here it's violence against women. I think the current rate is approximately 2 women a week are killed by their partners. That's epidemic to me. And I think that if suddenly we found out that 2 men a week were dying at the hands of their female partners, people would really sit up and take notice. And I think we don't take notice because we have grown accustomed to some kind of violence against women in our society.
Greg Hunt, what do you think about let's go back to the original question of the fight itself and Mayweather's role in it and what it tells us about ourselves? It's one of the biggest fights in history, and yet this man has this dark past.
Look, I actually think that's one of the very best and most powerful questions I've heard posed on this program over the years, and I have to say it was unexpected in the best way. It's provoking a new line of thinking. We refused his visa to Australia precisely because of the things that you set out, because of that history of violence, and in particular violence against women. He was deemed by the Australian government to be unfit to enter Australia. So effectively we did what Peter said, we ruled him out of our league. We weren't going to allow him in. I am frankly surprised that any sport would allow somebody to have a history of violence, particularly domestic violence, like that, and allow them to continue.
Mark Butler.
I agree. Violence against women, violence against children needs to be called out wherever it happens. And I think, particularly this year, we've been making some extraordinary progress in Australia in the community discussion around family violence. And to see that case is just such a distressing, depressing example of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. But it's a terrible indictment, I think, on the sport.
How do we account for the fact that the fight promoters, the public broadly, the global audience who paid most of them to actually see this fight turned a blind eye to all of this?
I think it's appalling. Particularly for young men, sports stars are such an important role model. And sports like the AFL, the NRL here, and frankly boxing internationally should be taking an incredibly strong stand not to allow people with a history like that to continue to be a role model to young men. I'm appalled by that example. Absolutely appalled. I'd like to think it would not happen here.
You're on my football club. Different politics,
you're
same
on my
football club. So, OK, I'm on your football club. They would take a very, very, very dim view of a player caught in that position, and I think most of the AFL clubs would. I don't know about it, NRL, I know nothing about it, but the AFL takes the behaviour of players on and off ground quite seriously.
So what do you make of all the people who turned up? And, you know, like I said, some of the richest, some of the most powerful, some of the most influential people in the world and in this country turned up to be ringside at that fight.
Look, I suppose they try and excuse themselves by saying, oh, well, you know, he's been convicted, he's paid his price, and there's an element of that you can consider. But at the same time, people of great notoriety that must know that they themselves act as role models for other people, you would think could lend a hand by saying, no, I'm not going to that fight. And they just backed out of showing any leadership. And they don't back out on other occasions, so it must say something about them.
All right, let's continue this theme with our next question. It's from Melissa Black.
There's no doubt that everyone needs to take responsibility for their own safety. However, as a young woman, it makes me incredibly uncomfortable that people are suggesting that the rights and freedoms of potential victims, that is women, be restricted in order to prevent rape. What about restricting the rights and freedoms of potential perpetrators? Should we be asking men to not walk in the dark unescorted just in case they might rape someone?
Peter Singer, I'll start with you.
Yeah, look, I don't really blame the people who've made remarks about the dangers of walking across parks at night. I mean, I think they apply to men and women. They can be dangerous places. You can't expect the state to protect you everywhere. We don't really want to have a state in which there are police in every park 24/7. So I think, you know, advising people how to stay safe is a reasonable sort of thing for people to do. And it's not really blaming the victim, it's just trying to reduce the incidence of victim. We know who's to blame. There's no question that it's the rapist or the assaulter who's to blame. But at the same time, using a bit of common sense to avoid being a victim, I don't see anything wrong with telling people to do that.
The choice of words sometimes trips people up, and the Mayor of Albury made a thoughtless remark that if women are out walking alone, it's an invitation for someone to take advantage of you. Now, to be fair to him, he's a former policeman, he's seen a lot of terrible things, and he did come out straight away and apologise for it. But that kind of remark is not uncommon.
Yeah, that's not the right language to use, but just to say, look, unfortunately there is a risk some sick, deranged person might prey on you if you do this, and we just cannot, much as we would like to, we cannot protect you wherever you go, at whatever time you go. That seems a reasonable thing to say.
Adrienne, this is the territory of your one-woman show, Asking for It,
Yes.
it's called, and obviously it's picking up on those themes. But going back to the questioner's thought, should we be asking men not to walk in the dark unescorted in case they were to rape someone?
I certainly think suggesting that women should not walk alone is no less illogical. It's as illogical to suggest that men don't go out so that women can be safe. I think anybody at this stage of that conversation that lingers in that part of the conversation completely sidesteps any hope of solving the problem. And it also, I'm never sure which is more surprising in those types of statements, the arrogance or the ignorance. Like most instances of rape happen with somebody you know and trust. So if you start telling women they can't walk in a park, you should probably start telling them they can't necessarily go home, they can't necessarily join the military. Like if that is the only way to address a problem, then that problem won't be solved. And you know, if I find that the rates of rape and violence against women to be at sort of epidemic proportions, and if we, you know, if there's a disease out there, you don't just look at the victims to try and figure out how to eradicate the disease. You would look at the source of the disease and then start to look at that. And I find that conversation that even begins with, well, she should have been careful, in this day and age is just wildly irresponsible.
You've had American politicians like Todd Aitken, congressman, go much further than that, haven't you?
Yes.
I mean, I suppose you'd have to explain for our audience what he said, and
it's really
he wasn't
easy.
alone either.
Yeah, it's easy to understand. He put forth this notion that if you got pregnant from being raped, it wasn't a legitimate rape because a woman's body would just shut down so that you didn't get pregnant, suggesting that somehow the pregnancy indicates that some part of her was okay with what happened, and then her body was receptive to that act.
Well, another congressman, Rick Santorum, actually went even further than that and said you should accept it as a gift from God if you did get pregnant from a rape.
Yes.
I mean, it's almost too shocking to repeat, but that's what he said.
I know, it really is. And, you know, I don't think... somebody who actually thinks that about a woman's body, I wouldn't trust with the keys to my car, let alone legislating, you know, things about women's bodies and stuff. That's just been brought up so many times that she should be careful, and it's a dead end. It is an absolute dead end to solving the problem.
I think Peter was going to jump back in there. So
I was just wondering what the evidence is that there's an epidemic of rape. I mean, we do, and quite properly, take a wider view of rape than previous generations did. I mean, you know, it used to be that a husband legally could not rape his wife, that there was assumed consent at all times from the woman that she would accept sexual advances from her husband. So that's one kind of rape that you can't compare with the past. But I think if you're talking about...
It's no less rape, though?
Oh, absolutely. I think, of course, it was a progressive advance, but what I'm saying is that I think we have actually made progress, and who knows how many rapes there were of that sort, of husbands raping their wives, when it was not even a crime, and there would be no point reporting it to the police because they would have laughed at you. My view of the way things have gone over many centuries is that violence in general has declined. Your chances of dying a violent death at the hands of your fellow human beings are less in this century than they've been in any previous century. And I wouldn't be surprised if the chances of a woman being raped are also less in this century than in any previous century.
Amanda Vanstone.
Well, I don't know about the figures. I haven't looked at them, but I think I agree with what's been said that it's a dead end to just focus on telling women where they might like to consider being more careful. That is a dead end. But I don't think it's a mistake. I agree with Peter. Using the right words, you do have to caution young girls especially about the path they take home if they're coming home on their own. I think that's just very sensible to do. It is still a shocking problem, domestic violence and rape, and we just haven't managed to deal with it. And part of it is because people who understand that someone has bashed their wife don't then ostracise that person and say, mate, sorry, it's not what our friends do. You're behaving like that, you just can't be a part of this friendship group. So Australians tend to, I think, I can't speak for all Australians, this is not my place, but I think people tend to say, well, the police will handle that, and don't themselves step in as a community and say, that's not on. Leave it up to the police.
Sorry, Amanda. Mark Butler, it was an ironic question to some degree, but should we be asking men not to walk in the dark unescorted unless they rape someone?
Well, I'm not sure that takes us any further than asking women not to walk unescorted. I think it really is... this language is important. I'm not sure I agree with Peter. This language is a much gentler version of the subliminal messages we send from the boxing question, really. Back to the Reclaim the Night movements of the 1970s, women have legitimately said you should not use language that cast any blame for these sorts of attacks on us exercising our freedom of movement. And I think that is very, very important. I think the officials you've talked about were doing their job. They were well-intentioned, providing advice, particularly to young women who are, becoming independent, to keep safe. But it is very important that we all use language, particularly public officials use language, that make it crystal clear that the blame for these attacks rests with criminal men, not with women exercising their freedom of movement. It rests with criminal men. And I think that is very important for public officials to keep in mind.
OK, Greg Hunt, briefly.
Look, I think the point is a very simple one with near unanimity here, and that is the victim is never to blame, and it's as simple as that. And that's something that has to be part of not just public discourse, but also the private discourse around this country. So as that sort of language isn't part of dialogue, but even more so, it isn't part of the way we think.
OK, let's move on. We've got a question that actually deals with at least part of Adrienne's performance. So let's hear from Kristen Daly.
My question is for Adrienne. A female audience member recently staged a protest against comedian Ray Badron because of his joke, "Gay people can make jokes about being gay, black people can make jokes about being black. Well, I can make jokes about rape." The intent of the joke was to express how people are often judged by their appearances and first impressions. Do you believe there's room for male comedians to joke about their experiences, specifically those experiences relating to their gender, without exploiting the power their gender may afford them?
Adrienne.
I think that I fall on the side of not censoring expression, whether it's in comedy or art or political speech. I think if you're a male comedian making a joke about rape, it would do you well to think really hard about why you're making that joke and why you want to make it, and what the gist of it is. Perhaps where the punchline lands, if the punchline lands on the victim of the act or the perpetrator. And so it's my belief that it's most likely that a woman might be able to use comedy in a more supple fashion to make a joke about gender and rape, or a joke that might interest me more. But I have heard intelligent male comedians make jokes about gender and even rape that I've found to be provocative and push a conversation forward from a comedic standpoint. I think the notion that you're being edgy simply because you talked about it and were willing to risk offending an audience member makes you, for my taste, not a terribly interesting comedian. And I think there is a little bit of a climate in comedy at the moment, I think, where people are delving into very heated subjects like suicide and race and rape in an effort to seem really edgy and daring.
Can you explain how you managed to do it? Because, I mean, for those who haven't seen your show, I mean, you break a lot of boundaries. You break taboos.
Yes.
You perform half naked to start with. I mean, these are things which would shock most people in the audience, even to hear it. Tell us why you chose to do it in that way and how you can actually make, in a way, humour out of such a gruesome subject.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, like I said, I think comedy is a really supple form to comment on the absurdities in life, and comedians have always done that, or not always, frequently. And I think, sometimes I think when you say the word rape and comedy in the same sentence, people have a very strong reaction because, of course, there's nothing funny about rape. So the notion that you would take it lightheartedly is shocking. But satire is an incredibly useful tool. And certainly I think that the ways that we talk about rape, the way that we talk about where women should or shouldn't walk in order to avoid it, the way we legislate women's bodies in the aftermath of rape and what their choices are, that is all completely available to the wildest of satires.
I've actually seen people suggest to you that you're putting yourself at risk in your performances, because there are a number of single men in the audience who, as you put it, go to be titillated. You get bucks parties come along to the show.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you walk that thin line?
In heels. I don't wear pants in my show. I wear a jacket and shoes. Not ridiculous. I wouldn't go out on stage barefoot. But I obviously, as a performer, I'm taking this notion of wearing and asking for it outfit to what I think is both a comedic extreme, because it looks really silly, as well as taking that logic that somehow what a woman's wearing affects how she is treated and possibly invites violent assault. So I am in a room, I drink gin and tonics during my show, I'm a very approachable and friendly gal, and I'm not wearing pants, and there's not much more of an asking for it outfit you can wear than that. And I don't get raped every night in my show. So to me, that act only happens when somebody's willing to rape you.
I'm going to go to the other woman on the panel because it's the least risky option. What do you think about her? I mean, it's not a show you probably queue up for.
First time I've been called that, but still. Look, in any genre of comedy, you can find people who do it badly and have bad taste, as you say, not the sort of comedic response you want, but comedy can bring things out of the dark. You know, there used to be a joke about a young priest who was taking confession and he forgot what the penance was for sex outside of marriage. So he heard the altar boys going past and, you know, pulled the curtain back and said, "Hey, what does Father O'Reilly give for sex?" And the kid said, "Mars Bar and a can of Coke." Now, you know, that was considered at the time to be a little bit risque.
I think it's probably considered that right
You know
now.
what I was doing? It was shedding a light on something that decades after I heard that joke, we now understand is not funny, and it was using comedy to raise that point. So it can be used effectively, but that doesn't mean that any rape joke is a funny joke.
Mark?
Well, I'm not very funny at all, so I'm not going to try a joke, but comedy is one of the most important weapons against the abuse of power we've ever had. People who abuse power hate nothing more than being laughed at. And good jokes directed at people who abuse their power, I think, are an incredibly important form of subversion. As Adrienne said, though, it's a very fine and important line not to cross over targeting things at the abuser into just getting a cheap laugh, or even worse, making a joke at the expense of victims. And I think that's really the question that's been asked. There is no one less qualified to determine and adjudicate where that line is than politicians, I'm happy to say. But you know, in the area of comedy, I think...
Doesn't stop politicians in the past from trying to do things.
And we
like
always get in trouble for doing it. I've done it. We always get in trouble for trying to mix politics with comedy. It's not a good mix. I am a defender of free speech in comedy because I think...
Actually, Bill Short seems to fail on a regular basis in that.
In spite of it often being incredibly uncomfortable and cringeworthy sometimes.
So are we talking about Bill Short?
No.
It is an incredibly important weapon against the abuse of power, and I'd hate to see it shut down for that reason.
Yeah, OK. And Greg Hunt wanted to jump in there, wanted to walk in the minefield briefly.
No, actually, I wasn't looking to walk into this space, but anyway, no. Yeah. There is a point of agreement with Mark here, and that is that anything which in any way focuses on the victim is inevitably going to be tasteless and almost certainly destructive. I'm not a great believer in censorship. I think we have laws which should be allowing free speech where possible, but then there are social conventions, and it's the distinction between the two that's important here. As a general principle, I think we can deal with these topics maturely, and I think that's the real development in society in the last, decade or more, that we can deal with suicide and sexual assault and mental illness in a way which we didn't. So that's, I think, the primary place to start in most of these things.
All right, let's move along. Our next question comes from Alice Sexton.
Peter, you suggest that Australians should ideally be donating a third of their income to charity. How will we achieve a change from the current culture where the focus is on living an individualistic lifestyle, where earning more to spend more, and it's harder than ever to break into the property market?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. The third is a little bit of an exaggeration. I mean, I'm not suggesting everyone. I've suggested in a book, The Life You Can Save, and in the organisation with that name, that there's a sliding scale depending how much you earn. And I think at the higher levels of income, yes, a third seems reasonable. At the lower levels, it would be too difficult. But your question is how we change this society and this culture. I think that a lot of people are actually looking for change. They're realising that by simply looking for material success, consuming more, spending more, you get on a hedonic treadmill. You have to keep working harder to maintain the same level of enjoyment at getting more consumer goods, bigger cars, houses, whatever it might be. And in fact, there's a lot of psychological research showing that if you are generous in contributing to causes that help others, if you think about others more, you are more satisfied with your life. That people who do that are more fulfilled, rate their lives higher than people who don't. So I'm hoping that this knowledge will spread. I'm trying to spread it in my own work. And
you actually call it the effective altruism movement. And
that's right.
Tell us about that. And actually, you might want to do that by telling us about this young British philosopher, Toby Ord.
Right. Well, Toby Ord actually is an Australian since we're here in Australia, though he is now working in Oxford. Toby Ord started an organisation called Giving What We Can in Oxford because he realised that he was just heading for an academic career, but he realised that he could live on less than he was going to earn. He was actually a graduate student at the time and was living on a quite modest amount, but he felt fine with that. So he tried to work out how much good he could do if he kept living at a modest level and giving away the rest that he was likely to earn as he advanced in his academic career, presumably to a professor at the end. And he worked out that if he took all that money over his lifetime and gave it to an organisation that was preventing people from going blind from a condition called trachoma, which is the most common cause of preventable blindness, he could save the sight of 80,000 people. And he thought that was really amazing, that, you know, a huge football stadium full of people who would be able to see because of what one person, and not Bill Gates, not a particularly wealthy person, had been able to give. So he started this organisation to put that message out there and to get people to think about living more ethically and encourage other people to pledge to do something of that sort.
Does he have a family and a mortgage in the way that the questioner was talking about?
Absolutely, he does, yes. He's married. Yes, they have a child just recently, I think. They had their first child. So yes, he does have a family. He has a pretty normal life. He thinks his life is quite good. He lives in England. He has enough money to take a holiday on the continent now and again. But he's still giving away a lot and doing a lot of good. And I'm sure he's finding his life much more satisfying than that of people who are just thinking about themselves.
I'm just going to stick with you just for a minute, because then there's the other side of the equation. You've got young, again, British academics, philosophers, who argue that if you're going to try and do the best you can for other people, you should aim for high-paid jobs like bankers and financiers and go to the stock market, make as much money as you can and then give as much of it away as possible.
Well, that's right, and that surprises people. But I've had a student decide to do that, a Princeton student called Matt Wager, who went into Wall Street, not because he wanted to earn a lot of money for himself, but because he realised that the more money you earn, the more money you have to give away. And he's been giving away half of his income each year. It's a six-figure sum that he's giving to effective charities. And he thinks he's doing more good that way than he would if he were to, say, become an aid worker, because there are plenty of people who want to be aid workers, and he would just be taking a job that somebody else, probably almost as good as him, would have got. But there aren't plenty of people going to Wall Street in order to give away half of their salary. And that can lead to organisations employing new positions altogether. So I think if you've got the right character and the right ability to do that and not be sucked into the temptation of saying, now I'm working alongside people with big apartments and driving Porsches and so on, so I've got to do that. If you can stick with it, I think it's a great thing to do.
Greg Hunt, are you taken by this notion?
Look, it's very powerful, and just to go to the original questioner, there are many ways that people give, and I would say this, that we actually have, I think, a very good and decent society. We had this morning, just in my own electorate on the Mornington Peninsula, a seniors forum, and we had a lot of people who came in, and some of the presenters were from the community, talking about things such as the Rosebud Police Senior Citizens Register, where you have volunteers who are working with senior citizens. So some give money, some give time, some give mentoring, and a surprising amount of society are involved in that. We had, as one of our speakers today, Pat Farmer, who ran from the North Pole to the South Pole, an amazing Australian. And he gave up a year of his life. He raised an extraordinary sum for clean water through the Red Cross. And just the sense of respect that that group had for him, but also others in the local community. So the answer is, giving is important, but there are many ways to give, and a surprising number of Australians do that, but we can always do more.
That's at the personal level. What about at the macro level with governments? I mean, could effective altruism be a way to distribute Australian aid, for example?
Well, one of the things we do is we try to look at what is the absolute best way to get results. What will, and I know that this is what Julie Bishop is doing, what will ensure that the most number of people get clean water? What will ensure that the most number of people receive different health treatments, such as eye treatments? So she is looking, and we are looking at what will give the best human dividend overseas from our aid program, and there are different delivery mechanisms.
Is that a way of compensating for the diminishing aid budget?
Look, you do what you can as a country.
But Greg, why can we not give more? In fact, we're giving less and less, when the United Kingdom, which is surely not a richer country than Australia, has now met the United Nations target of 0.7% of gross domestic product. And with the foreshadowed aid cuts, we're going to get down to what, 0.23% or something? I mean, we'll be about a third of what the UK is giving on a per capita basis.
Look, there are two things here. One is to make sure that what you do is very effective. The second
I agree with that entirely.
is to live within your means, so as you aren't borrowing to give money away. The only way you can do this sustainably is if you live within your means, because if you keep building a bigger and bigger legacy for future generations, you're also taking from them. So you have to make sure that we're leaving future generations a deep and powerful legacy with a positive future, not with a heavy burden of debt.
OK, let's hear from this side of the panel. Mark Butler.
Well, I might just make a very brief comment about foreign aid. I mean, it's quite clear the foreign aid projections, which had started to rise very significantly over the years, took the major brunt of budget cuts from the government last year, and that was a decision that the government took that I think was probably regarded as an easy decision, but I think it was a poor one. But I want to address the question more particularly because Australia has seen a lower rate of giving in financial terms than countries to which we usually compare ourselves, like the UK, the US and Canada. And seen it for some time. And I think it's interesting to reflect on that. It's been increasing, but still at a slightly lower rate. And I don't know whether that's got something to do with the fact that we're very highly leveraged. We've got significant household debts because of much higher house prices, but, you know, it's worth examining that. What we do, though, better than most other countries, is volunteer. As Greg said, our giving rates were a little bit lower than average in the OECD. Our volunteering rates, that in-kind contribution, are substantially higher than the OECD average, and they've been rising very significantly for many years. I think the last time I looked, it was about 700 million unpaid hours of volunteering are performed by Australian adults, not to mention what children do as well. I mean, that's worth a very substantial amount and is utterly critical to the ability of a lot of church and charitable organisations to keep functioning. So I think we also need to be holistic in thinking about giving, not just about financial giving, but also the sort of in-kind volunteering that's a much more settled part of Australian culture, I think.
Amanda.
Well, ditto to everything he said. I once was the minister who had responsibility for volunteering, and we are great at it. From 14 up to all ages you can't imagine are choosing ways and places to give, and often people who haven't got the money to give, as Peter says, you've got to have a sliding scale for this sort of thing. There's a woman who runs an op shop for the Royal Flying Doctor Service in the Riverland. She's raised hundreds of thousands of dollars over her time in running this op shop. She couldn't give $100,000, but in effect she has by giving her time. I have a couple of concerns with the notion of, just giving a portion of your income, because I think it's outsourcing goodness to someone else. And I don't think you should be able to do that. I think we actually have to focus on trying to be better people ourselves, and it will come from that. We have, as Peter says, become very materialistic. Kids don't share rooms anymore. They have their own room, they have a TV, they don't go to school unless they've got the right sneakers. So I don't disagree with any of the shocking way we've developed into materialists. I think the way out of that, though, is not just to outsource the goodness and say, well, I give some of my money, so I'm a good person. I think you have to actually be a good person.
Do people still wear sneakers? Just out of interest? I'm just going... look,
joggers, OK.
On the question of giving, you're watching Q&A, and that means you're interested in the world. It also means that thousands of you are watching with a phone or a computer in your hand, so why not use that device to make a difference to some of the millions of people affected by the earthquake in Nepal? Transferring a small amount of your wealth can make a big difference to some of the poorest people in the world. If you can afford to give, please SMS the word Nepal to the number that's now showing on your screen to find out how to make a donation to Oxfam, or look for the Quanda tweet that will link you to the ABC Appeals page and show you how to donate to charities working in Nepal. Well, our next question on a similar subject comes from Jay Mahendra Raj.
Thanks, Tony. The US-based organisation GiveWell evaluates the effectiveness of charities through measures such as quality-adjusted life years. So my question is, the next time I bump into someone on the street who's asking for donations, what sort of questions should I be asking them to make sure that my money is going towards an effective charity and not a bureaucratic money-grabbing machine?
Peter Singer, we'll start with you, obviously, and GiveWell takes a pretty hard line on this. I think there's only 3 charities that they recommend.
I think they boosted them. I think they're up to half a dozen or so now, but it's a very small slice. Yes, GiveWell, which you can find at givewell.org, is a very rigorous evaluator and would, I guess, say you shouldn't be giving to people to just accost you on the street. You should be researching the charities, checking them, and unless they're on their list of ones that they have, that have demonstrated their effectiveness. Not that the others necessarily aren't effective, but just that they haven't been transparent enough or produced the information to show that they're effective. This charity that I'm wearing the badge from today, the lifeyoucansave.org, that I've been involved with, is a little bit broader. So we feel that GiveWell is so tough that it misses out things that are good but can't be evaluated. So if you go there, that will give you another list of organisations that you can support. And it's also, you can get involved with it, and it helps to promote these ideas that we've been talking about, and I'm pleased to say we've had a lot of consensus on, about trying to live a more ethical life.
So you make quite strong value judgments on different types of charities, don't you? And I saw, for example, you make the case that it's not an effective charity to give to the group which creates or which train guide dogs for the blind, which surprised me enormously. So perhaps you should explain how you came to that conclusion.
It's a matter of getting the best value for your money, and it's strange that people tend not to think about that in the charitable field as they would. If you were buying a dishwasher, you would check some consumer reports on which one gives you the best value for money. But with charities, people don't. So, yeah, you can say, sure, it's good to train guide dogs to help the blind. But if you're doing that in Australia or in another affluent country, it's going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars. In the United States, it costs about over $40,000 to train a dog and to train the blind person so that they can work together and the dog can be helpful to the blind person. Now, as I mentioned before in talking about Toby Ord, you can prevent someone becoming blind in a developing country for maybe something like $100 per case of blindness averted. So, what's better, to prevent someone becoming blind or to give a blind person a guide dog? I think it's clearly better to prevent someone becoming blind. Plus, it costs only $100. So, you can calculate for $40,000 how many people you can prevent being blind, it just seems to me clear that it gives you better value, and therefore that's what we should be doing.
Adrienne, do you buy this sort of value for money approach to donating to charity?
I was actually swinging that model back to our conversation about rape, because I thought if you put that model to language, if language was currency, then you'd get far better value at preventing rape, i.e. preventing blindness, if you addressed it from that side. So I feel like there's a similar thing, like in that case, sort of using language of public officials to say that women shouldn't do a certain thing to avoid getting raped seems like a similar model where you're not getting very good value for that conversation about how you can solve that. That's where my head went on that one. But I would love to think that I earned enough money that I could give away a third of my...
Yeah, Amanda wants to jump in.
Well, Tony, I do some work with Vision 2020, which is a peak lobby group to bring together a whole range of groups working on preventable blindness. And it is true that for a very small amount of money, you can prevent blindness in Indigenous communities and in third world countries. And the Australian government does some of that in some of its aid program and does some of that type of work in Indigenous communities. But I don't think you can say, well, you're already blind and there's nothing we can do about you, so we don't really care. I think the guide dogs do a terrific job. It isn't inexpensive. They do tremendous work training dogs to deal with autistic children. And just to give you an idea of how hard it can be if you've got an autistic kid, if they get frightened in the traffic, they might just run out into the road. So they can train a dog that when it feels the tug on the lead attached to the kid, the dog will just sit down. And the kid, so that means that family can go shopping, can go on picnics. So, don't stop giving to the guide dogs.
Let's move on to, we've got a few different subjects to cover tonight, so let's move on to a completely different question. It's from Peter Yule. Peter.
I'm the grandfather of 3 children under 4. There's a very good chance that they, unlike most of us here, will be alive at the end of the century. There's also a very high probability that the Earth's climate will have become much less amenable to all forms of life by then, unless we start now to make some big changes in the amount of carbon dioxide we output, suggesting, say, 50% by 1930 and 100% by, 2030 and 100% by 2050. My question to those on the panel that actually do something about this, Mark Butler and Greg Hunt, how are you going to convince the climate change deniers in your party that serious changes in the way we make energy have to be made now to avoid the risk of the Earth becoming uninhabitable for my grandchildren and yours?
Now, we could go through the whole program discussing this part of this question in particular. Greg Hunt, I'll ask for brief answers.
Sure. Look, very briefly, the answer is just over 10 days ago, we staged an emissions reduction auction. We acquired the largest reduction in emissions in Australian history, 47 million tonnes, and this is reducing emissions through lowest cost projects around the country. More than 30 million tonnes of that was through on-farm work, through forestry projects, reforestation, through avoided deforestation, great environmental outcomes, but also real reductions in emissions in a way that we've never seen before on such a scale in Australia. So that presumption to your question is one which doesn't apply. It's not about belief or disbelief. It's only now. That boat has long sailed. We're right in the space of only now being focused on what will deliver the greatest results at the fastest possible pace, which is what I'm focused on. And for me, this has been the work of my life, and I'm absolutely delighted that there's been such a huge uptake or delivering huge reductions in emissions.
Mark Butler.
I'm tempted to go down that path about the auction a couple of weeks ago, but I'm not going to. I'm going to try and answer this question. And if I get time, I'd like to respond to the auction. But there are no climate change deniers in my party, or not that I've come across at least. The challenge for us is how we translate a couple of very fundamental beliefs into practical legislation in the Parliament. And Australia, unfortunately, has a level of division around the basic tenets of what is needed to deal with climate change that many other countries just don't have. If you look at the UK general election, they very happily aren't having the level of debate we still have here. What we need is a substantial agreement around the need for Australia to do its fair share to ensure that global warming does not exceed 2 degrees Celsius. Now, that is the most fundamental tenet of climate change policy, and yet still we don't have that in Australia. The Energy Policy White Paper that the government released only a few weeks ago is predicated on a 4-degree warming scenario. It looks at the economic gains that will be able to be achieved by Australia through a 4-degree scenario. So we need to get back to at least agreeing about the most basic tenets. 2 degrees must be the limit of global warming above pre-industrial levels. Australia must do its fair share. We, per capita, are the heaviest polluters in the OECD, so we need to do some heavy lifting there, in line with what is being proposed in America and many European countries as well. And we need to have independent advice, not tossed around just in the Parliament, but independent expert advice from bodies like the Climate Change Authority about what those reduction targets should be over the course of the period that you're talking about.
Very quick response to this one, if you can. If Greg Hunt's direct action policies are seen to work in the period that they're in government, would you adopt them yourself?
They won't work. They won't work.
They just did.
This auction, as an example, one of the contracts that Greg entered into was to AGL, the biggest polluter in the country, to underwrite some payments for landfill gas projects that have already been operating, in some cases, for more than 10 years. So Greg is going to hand over millions of taxpayers' dollars to the biggest polluter in the country to continue the landfill gas operations that they've been operating, in some cases, for more than 10 years. So there will be some reduction in carbon pollution, but it was going to happen anyway.
No.
It was going to happen anyway.
All right, OK.
At the same time,
he's got to be able to respond to that specific point.
No, there's another important point. At the same time, AGL is able to continue increasing its carbon pollution from the coal-fired generators it operates in the other part of its business. I mean, this is a hopeless policy and an absolutely irresponsible use of taxpayers' dollars. OK, well, you obviously get a right of reply.
Thank you. Look, very briefly, 2 things here. Firstly, you talk about an independent regulator. The Clean Energy Regulator ran what has been seen by everybody as a flawless process where their test was genuine emissions reduction. And they've run a process compared with, dare I mention what we saw with the home insulation program or green loans or Citizens Assembly or cash for clunkers, where there was no criticism of the process, where there was an outstanding outcome. And what we're seeing is in small communities right across Australia, there will be farms that benefit, there will be local biodiversity benefits, and most significantly and importantly, a massive amount of emissions reduction on a scale never seen before in Australia at a fraction of the cost of what occurred under the carbon tax, without that being thrown on to the general public through higher electricity and gas prices.
OK, do you want to just quickly address the AGL issue? Because Mark Butler more or less said this direct action program with AGL, the gas company, is essentially paying a polluter to do what they were doing anyway.
No, I know you've sometimes used the same language as the ALP about paying polluters. This is completely false. What we are doing, and this is the really interesting thing...
I'm just telling you what he said so you can respond to it. Don't sort of put me in there.
You and I have had these debates for many years, Tony, and
I tell you, the person who said that most clearly was Malcolm Turnbull.
It's always the case that somehow it's the other...
Malcolm Turnbull, I think, is in your party.
It's the other take. But let me say this. Everything that's happening is genuine abatement, real emissions reduction, and I would note that they ran a program called the Clean Tech Investment Program, which gave out, I think it was about $1 billion. The Auditor General found that there was no effective allocation mechanism, no guarantee of value for money, and 58% of the projects were not justified, whereas we've had 100% tick-off from an independent probity advisor. That means that the public gets value for money, but most importantly, we get massive emissions reductions in Australia on a scale never seen before.
OK, the next question addresses this from Paris Rains. Sorry to those of you with your hand up. Paris already asked this question.
As a young person concerned with the current government's lack of action on climate change, Minister Hunt, what carbon reduction targets will you be taking to the climate change conference in Paris at the end of the year to talk about intergenerational equity? Will it be the 30% recommended by the Climate Change Authority, and if not, why not?
Sure. So we'll set those, as we say, in the middle of the year. Right now, we're holding consultations with groups around Australia. In the last week, Julie Bishop and myself have met with whether it's the Climate Institute, WWF, Greenpeace, business groups, academic groups, senior business leaders, and we'll be doing more of that this week and taking responses from around the country. As a result of the auction, what we do see is that not only will we achieve our 2020 targets, we've already achieved our first Kyoto targets, we'll achieve our second targets, and we'll not just meet them, we'll beat them, but the speed limits as to what we can do post-2020 have been lifted. So we will make a really constructive contribution, and I am passionate about doing this, and as of now, we can do more than we could have done 2 weeks ago.
OK, with respect, that went nowhere near answering the question, perhaps because you don't have an answer, and that's fair enough.
No, it's because we're going to set our target after public consultation in early July, which is what we've always said we'd do.
Let me ask you the obvious question. If direct action is your main tool and it costs roughly $2 billion to achieve a 5% reduction, what will it cost using those policies to achieve a 30% reduction?
No, with respect, the analysis is wrong. We'll achieve about a minus 13% reduction on our 2005 figures by 2020, very comparable with the United States, and it's one of a number of tools. Firstly, our emissions are reducing as a country compared with expectations. Secondly, we are achieving enormous reductions through the Emissions Reduction Fund. And then thirdly, there are a range of other measures, things such as looking at energy efficiency, vehicle efficiency, fuel efficiency. We're looking at what's called the safeguards mechanism, which does put a budget on individual firms such as AGL, completely, I'd say, with respect, in contradiction of what you said, Mark.
OK, you can respond to that, but I want to hear too from our other panellists briefly, so go ahead. OK,
well, the Australian Industry Group said recently that to achieve the target, say, that President Obama has put on the table would cost $25 billion for Greg's policy, and that assumes that there aren't increases in emissions elsewhere. For example, what we've seen since the carbon price was abolished last year and Tony Abbott attacked the renewable energy target is that emissions in the electricity sector have started to increase. The latest data was that on an annualised basis they've increased by more than 4 million tonnes per year. So even taking Greg's 47 million tonnes that he bought with your money a couple of weeks ago over the next 5 to 10 years, if that increase continues, almost all of it is offset by the increase in pollution from the electricity sector. This is the central problem with this direct action policy.
Well, look, the last point here is twofold. Firstly,
can you just make it one-fold because we're already running out of time?
The notion that the carbon tax was free to the public is ridiculous. Firstly, the public paid $15 billion. Secondly, there was $30 billion allocated to large companies, the large polluters, through the carbon tax associated programs, including, believe it or not, $5.5 billion to brown coal generators with no strings attached to keep generating. AGL received $250 million in cash in the days before the carbon tax started. The largest handout to a single industry in Australian history was to the brown coal generators under the previous government.
Now, Peter wants to get in. Amanda, I'm sure, wants to get in. Go ahead.
I just want to take up the point that Australia does have, in the OECD countries, some of the highest per capita emissions. And I want to put it this way. Imagine that your child went to a birthday party. There were 25 children there, and the host had cut the birthday cake into 25 equal slices. And your child went and grabbed 3 of those slices. What would you say to them? Because that's what Australia is doing, right? We are emitting 3 times as much greenhouse gases as the United Kingdom, 3 times as much as, more than 3 times as much as China, per capita I'm talking about, of course. 4 times as much as Mexico, 3 times as much as Brazil. So we are, you know, there's just a limited amount that the atmosphere can take of greenhouse gases. And we are really taking 3 times our per capita fair share of what those greenhouse gases are. I have to say this is unconscionable, and I think a target of a 5% reduction by 2020 doesn't go anywhere near remedying the unfairness of what we're taking.
OK, I'm sorry to those people with your hands up. We've got a few other issues to get to. The next question's a video. It's come from Lishi Su in Mill Park, Victoria.
Those Australians publicly denigrating President Widodo as being weak, despite broad Indonesian sentiment being overwhelmingly in favour of the death penalty, probably sealed the fate of Andrew Chan and Muran Sukumaran. Do the actions and post-execution reactions of the Australian government and most of the Australian community show yet again how arrogant, hypocritical and ignorant we are of Asian mindsets, cultures and domestic politics?
Amanda Vanstone.
Well, it's a bit aggressive about it, but you know, I do think that we as Australians don't understand Indonesia. We really haven't got a grip on how developed it is. I know it's got third world problems, and we somehow think that because we don't think people should do something, we can be the world's police and go and say, well, you shouldn't do that. They're a sovereign country, they're entitled to make what laws they like. We support the UN in opposing the death penalty. I think the death penalty is terrible. I think it's terrible it happens in the United States. And I never want it to happen. It's taking someone's life, and I just don't think that's the appropriate way to run your criminal justice system. But if it were me and I was going to lose my life because I'd done something wrong, I think I'd rather die instantly by a bullet to the heart than take, 12 to 30 minutes in some states in the United States because they got the wrong drugs. And I don't see the outcry in the Australian media about that. So I think we are a bit two-faced about it. You know, if you go to some of these countries, the risk you're going to run, and we know that that's going to happen. If someone gets caught, there's a serious risk of that. I think we should diplomatically proceed always to try and convince not just Indonesia but the other countries that still engage in this that it's fundamentally wrong. But we shouldn't think that it's more wrong when it's one of ours.
So was it wrong to pull out the ambassador in protest?
No, I think it's fair enough to make your point by recalling your ambassador for discussions, and that happens all the time. You know, you have a bit of a brouhaha.
It's never happened once in Indonesia.
All around the world, on numbers of occasions, we have, and other countries have, withdrawn their ambassador as a way of saying publicly...
We had the Indonesian military kill a whole bunch of journalists in East Timor and we didn't pull our ambassador.
Well, you asked me a question, I'm just giving you an answer. I think it is fair enough. It is a commonplace diplomatic tool to withdraw your ambassador for a period of time. And we can do other things. We can keep working through the UN. But can we as a nation say to the Indonesians, we're smarter than you, we know what we're doing and you shouldn't do this? No.
Peter Singer.
Yeah, I actually tend to agree with Amanda that you know, the fact that we're having this stand against Indonesia and not against the United States is pretty hypocritical. It's never been an issue in the United States. And if we really wanted to get angry with Indonesia, as you said, there was a killing of our journalists, but there was also the killing of large numbers of West Papuans who were peacefully demonstrating for their freedom 15 years or so ago, I think it was. You know, that seems to me much more of an atrocity than executing people who were convicted under their laws, and I don't think anybody doubts that they were guilty. And I say this as I'm also opposed to the death penalty, but I think we've been highly selective in our indignation. I think the newspapers have kind of drummed it up as a kind of a media story because it's a human interest story which has a deadline that we're all working towards. And I think it's really a distortion to give so much emphasis to that as compared with the many other things that we can and should be doing to save lives.
I'd like to add something, if I may. You know, people were saying that, and I think this is probably true, that the Indonesian government misused this. There was an enormous amount of publicity. I mean, transferring those two young men to whatever the name of the island was did not need police in riot gear. It was all designed to give a lot of publicity domestically to the fact that they were playing a strong hand. So you can look at that and say, well, I don't think human life should be dealt with like that. If you are going to have the death penalty, at least you could behave in a more discreet fashion. At the same time, though, you come to Australia and name the media outlet that hasn't used this to try and boost their ratings. I think it's been terrible the way Indonesian media have responded, and I haven't been impressed with the Australian media dealing with it either.
Adrienne, can I hear from you on this? I mean, you obviously come from a country where they execute an awful lot of people. I mean, Texas, it's into the hundreds a year now, I think.
Yes.
Well, I'm not sure if that's true, but certainly hundreds over a short period of time.
Yeah, shockingly, 32 of our 50 states still have the death penalty. And as far as my understanding, it has never borne out to prove that it's a deterrent to violent crime. And in fact, all of the states that have gotten rid of the death penalty experience lower rates of violent crime. So how it remains in a civilized society as a way to deal with that, or an attempt to solve the problem of violent crime, seems ridiculous. And I know in America it often plays out in the media as a sort of form of retribution, and that it's sort of delivering some sort of closure to the families of the victim. And it is often the victim's family is often invited to witness it, which is an entirely barbaric state of affairs. So yes, I wish that Australia would take as much interest and opposition to what we're doing in America as they do in Indonesia.
All right, I'm being told we've got time for one last question. We're going to take that. It's from Jessica Abood.
If we're going to give chimpanzees certain rights for being intelligent, self-aware and emotionally complex, does that lack of qualities in other animals then mean that they're going to be discriminated against? Who will be their lawyers?
Yeah, Peter Singer, I'm sure you think this is First, maybe you start by telling us about the historical case that's going to be fought out in New York shortly, but I'm sure you would want it to go further than that.
Yes, indeed. So there have been attempts to get legal rights for chimpanzees, specifically to get a writ of habeas corpus issued, which says basically, bring me the body that you're holding and show me why you're keeping that person in detention. So after a number of rejections, there is now a judge in Manhattan who has issued an order to Stony Brook University, which is holding chimpanzees that it's using in research, to show why it's justified to keep them in detention. And that provides the first glimmer of an opening. I wouldn't put it further than that, that possibly the courts are not going to regard chimpanzees simply as property, but are going to say that they may have some legal right to be free or to be sent to a sanctuary or something of that sort. Obviously, they can't literally be
They talk about
free.
rights of personhood. Now, that doesn't mean human rights, does it? It means legal rights.
That's
sometimes
right. I mean,
corporations are regarded
exactly.
as a person.
The law recognises things that are not human beings as persons, and corporations are a clear example. So it would mean that they have standing in court, essentially, to claim those rights. Now, to take the second bit of your question, what does that mean about other animals that are not as smart as chimpanzees? I would see that the extension of these basic rights to chimpanzees would be a kind of a bridge that would help to narrow the gulf that I think we now feel exists between humans and animals. So we think that there's an enormous difference between humans and all animals. And when we use this term animals, we mean everything from a chimpanzee to, I don't know, maybe a snail. Whereas in fact, of course, we're very closely related to chimpanzees if you look at our DNA and relationship. And chimpanzees are much more distantly related even to monkeys than they are to us. They're closer to us. So if we can narrow that gulf a bit and establish a bridgehead, then I hope that there'll be benefits that will flow in the longer run to other animals as well.
Will the judge require that these two chimps actually be present in court as part of
No, my understanding is that that's not part of the requirement. It will be possible for the lawyers representing, it's something called the Non-Human Rights Project that's brought this case. The lawyers representing them will make the arguments in court, but they will not be present.
Let's hear from the other humans on the panel. Greg Hunt?
Sure.
If you were on the jury, would you vote for the chimps?
I like the chimps. What I'd say is this, that we have to have really strong animal cruelty prevention laws in Australia, and generally we do. I think the most public outcry that I receive in my portfolio about different things is when there are cases and stories of animals being mistreated. People have, and I would maybe phrase it differently, Peter. People, I think, already have a deep connection with animals. There are some who abuse them.
I think they're selective, right?
But, you know, there is this instinctive engagement that people have with the vast bulk of the animal world.
Are you talking about when they see them on their dinner plates?
No, look,
well, I mean,
people want to engage
clearly
with the wider
we do
world.
eat some animals and not others, so we make distinctions here.
Look, obviously, but seriously, no offence.
That is a serious question. You wouldn't eat a dog, but you would eat a pig. And they have similar intelligence.
What we need is very strong animal prevention or animal cruelty prevention laws, but also species protection, and that's the thing that we're facing in Australia now. Species decline, in particular, we've lost a lot of mammals, so the whole notion of protecting species and species recovery is a space for government to play in.
OK, well, we're running out of time, but we'll hear briefly from our other panellists. Adrienne, have you thought much about this?
A little bit. I think it was brought up that I think, you know, there may be chimps have demonstrated more compassion and intelligence than some of our American politicians.
Thank you for that qualification.
Yes, I know where I am. So, you know, that's sort of interesting. I don't know. It seems like a huge thing to grant personhood to animals, but I think it speaks to a larger thing about how we...
It doesn't actually mean you're calling them a person. It should be...
Right.
It's a person in the dictionary is a human.
Right.
A person in legal terms in this regard
yes.
is just something that's not property and has certain rights attached to it. So it's slightly complicated.
Yeah, it's very complicated. I think it speaks to us taking more time to think about how we treat living things, be they animals or human. I don't know if this is the same law that applied, like in the Hobby Lobby case, to corporations. Is that the same application of personhood?
Yeah, well, they're a person on different grounds, but yes,
Right.
corporations certainly are.
I think it's trickier than just chimpanzees.
It is, indeed. Amanda?
Well, I'm an animal lover, and I think we should have very, very strong animal cruelty laws and do nasty, nasty things to people who are nasty to animals. I lose my more moderate sense when someone is cruel to an animal and think, well, you know, the animal can't speak for itself, it can't answer back, can't defend itself. But at the same time, I come back to what Peter suggested earlier in terms of looking at which charities you give money to. If these are hotshot lawyers, I think I could give them some higher priority jobs. Maybe. It's a good thing. Look, it's a good thing to look at what we do, and I do not condone cruelty to animals.
And incidentally, I think they're volunteering, so you'll approve of that.
Thank you.
OK, I'm sorry to say we're over time. That is all we have time for tonight, so please thank our panel. Peter Singer, Greg Hunt, Adrienne Truscott, Amanda Vanstone and Mark Butler.
Well done. You did a great job. It was really, clear on that.
Now, thank you. Next Monday Q&A will be joined by the Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Christian Porter, the Shadow Minister for Communications, Jason Clare, political analyst with the Financial Review, Jennifer Hewitt, and fresh from his legal victories, the big man with a shrinking political party, Clive Palmer. Until next week's Q&A, good night.